Let me ask you something that most people never think about until it's too late. If I could show you a photograph of your eyes from 10 years ago and place it beside a photograph taken today, would you expect to see a difference? Most people would say yes. After all, aging changes everything. The skin changes, the joints change, the hair changes. So naturally, the eyes must change too. That's what we've been told our entire lives. But here's the problem. That explanation is incomplete. Because when many adults begin losing visual clarity after 60, the assumption is almost always the same. I guess my eyes are just getting older. And once that belief takes hold, the conversation usually ends. A stronger prescription, a brighter reading lamp, maybe a discussion about cataracts. Then life moves on. What almost nobody asks is a much more important question. Why are the eyes changing in the first place? Not what the eye chart shows, not what strength your glasses need to be, but what process is driving those changes underneath the surface. Because the truth may surprise you. Many of the most important threats to vision don't begin inside the eye. They begin in the bloodstream, years before vision becomes noticeably worse. And that's exactly why so many people miss them. The body is incredibly good at compensating. It can hide dysfunction for a long time, years, sometimes decades, until one day something subtle happens. You find yourself holding a menu farther away. Reading becomes more tiring. Night driving becomes uncomfortable. Headlights seem brighter than they used to. The print on a medication bottle starts looking smaller every year. Most people think these are isolated problems. They're not. They're clues. The question is whether we recognize them as clues. During my years working with older adults, I've noticed something fascinating. People often assume their eyes are failing when what is actually failing is the environment supporting those eyes. That's a very different problem. Think about the retina for a moment. The tissue responsible for turning light into the images you see. It operates every second you're awake, reading, driving, watching television, recognizing faces, walking down a staircase. The energy demand is enormous. In fact, the cells responsible for vision are among the most active cells anywhere in the human body. That means they require constant support, constant oxygen, constant nutrients, constant blood flow. When any part of that support system begins to struggle, the eyes often become one of the first places where evidence appears. Not because the eyes are weak, but because they're working so hard. And that's where today's conversation begins. Not with glasses, not with prescriptions, not even with the eye itself, but with a process happening throughout the body that silently influences vision every single day. Before we go further, I need to make one thing absolutely clear. If you've experienced a sudden loss of vision, a sudden shower of new floaters, flashing lights that weren't there before, or what feels like a curtain moving across part of your sight, don't keep watching. Those symptoms require immediate medical evaluation. What we're discussing today is completely different. We're talking about the slow changes, the ones that arrive quietly, the ones most people dismiss as normal aging, the ones that often have roots much deeper than they realize. Because once you understand what is happening beneath the surface, you'll start looking at your vision in an entirely different way. And it all starts with a simple observation. Many people don't lose visual clarity all at once. They lose it gradually. And the pattern of that decline can reveal far more than most eye exams ever will. Think about your own eyesight for a moment. Not 5 years ago, not 10 years ago, today. Is it equally sharp from morning to night? For many people, the answer is no. The difference isn't dramatic. It's subtle. The kind of thing most people never mention during an eye appointment. Maybe reading feels easier first thing in the morning. Maybe road signs seem slightly less clear after lunch. Maybe the blur becomes more noticeable in the evening, especially after dinner. Most people blame fatigue, and sometimes fatigue is part of the explanation, but not always, because there is something else happening that deserves attention. Your eyes do not exist in isolation. Every structure inside the eye lives in the same biological environment as the rest of your body. The same blood, the same nutrients, The same metabolic signals, the same chemical changes occurring hour after hour throughout the day. One of the most overlooked examples of this involves the lens. The lens is a remarkable structure, crystal clear, flexible, designed to focus light precisely onto the retina. For most of our lives, we never think about it. It simply does its job. But unlike many tissues in the body, the lens doesn't have a direct blood supply feeding it. Instead, it depends on the fluid surrounding it. And that fluid reflects what's happening in your bloodstream. That's where things become interesting, because the environment around the lens is not constant. It changes, particularly after meals. Imagine two different breakfasts. The first is a sweet pastry and a large sugary coffee. The second is eggs, yogurt, or fish with a handful of nuts. The calorie difference might not be enormous, but the body's response can be very different. One creates a rapid rise in blood sugar. The other creates a much steadier pattern. Why does that matter? Because when blood sugar rises sharply, it changes the environment surrounding delicate tissues throughout the body, including the eye. Over time, many people begin noticing something they never connect to metabolism. Their vision feels inconsistent. Some days better, some days worse, some hours clearer, some hours blurrier. The assumption is usually that glasses need updating, but temporary fluctuations often tell a different story. They're clues that the eye may be responding to changes occurring elsewhere. I remember speaking with a man in his late 60s who complained that his vision seemed unpredictable. Not terrible, just inconsistent. Some afternoons he could read comfortably. Other afternoons the same page looked softer. His prescription hadn't changed significantly. His eye exam looked relatively stable. Yet the pattern continued. Eventually he began paying attention to when the blur occurred. Not surprisingly, it almost always followed large, carbohydrate-heavy meals. The relationship wasn't perfect. Biology rarely is. But it was obvious enough that he couldn't ignore it anymore. For the first time, he stopped asking, "What's wrong with my eyes?" and started asking, "What's happening inside my body before the blur appears?" That's a much better question. Because once you start looking for patterns, you begin seeing connections that were invisible before. And the lens is only the beginning. What concerns me far more is what happens deeper inside the eye. Because temporary blur is one thing. The health of the retina is something else entirely. And the retina depends on some of the smallest and most fragile blood vessels in the human body. When those vessels begin struggling, the consequences can take years to become visible. But once they do, the effects are much harder to ignore. The retina is one of the most extraordinary tissues in the human body. Most people never think about it. They think about their glasses, their prescription, their cataracts, but not the retina itself. And yet, every image you see depends on it. The face of a loved one, the words on a page, the color of a sunset, the expression on a grandchild's face. None of it exists without the retina. What makes the retina so remarkable is the amount of energy it consumes. Gram for gram, it ranks among the most metabolically active tissues in the body. That means it has very little room for error. It needs oxygen, it needs nutrients, it needs healthy circulation, and it needs all three continuously. Not once a day, not once a week, every minute. To make that possible, the retina relies on an incredibly delicate network of microscopic blood vessels. These vessels are so small that a red blood cell often has to pass through them one at a time. Think about that for a moment. Your ability to read a sentence, recognize a face, or drive safely depends on blood vessels thinner than a human hair. That's how precise the system is, and that's exactly why it becomes vulnerable. When the bloodstream is healthy, these tiny vessels do their job quietly. Nobody notices them. But when the metabolic environment begins to change, they often become one of the first places where stress appears. The challenge is that this doesn't happen overnight. Most vision problems don't arrive dramatically. They develop slowly. A little damage, then a little more, then a little more, until years later someone notices the result. And by that point, the process may have been unfolding for a very long time. One of the biggest misconceptions I encounter is the belief that retinal damage only matters if someone has diabetes. The reality is more complicated. Long before a diagnosis appears in a medical chart, the body can already be experiencing repeated periods of metabolic stress, repeated glucose spikes, repeated inflammation, repeated oxidative stress. The retina doesn't care what label appears on your medical record. It responds to the environment it's exposed to every day. That's why two people can have similar fasting blood sugar numbers and very different long-term outcomes. One spends most of the day in a relatively stable metabolic state. The other experiences repeated spikes after breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Those differences matter, and over years, they matter a great deal. I once spoke with a retired engineer who couldn't understand why his eyesight seemed to be changing faster than expected. His annual blood work looked reasonable. His doctor wasn't concerned. Yet he kept noticing something strange. The blur wasn't random. It followed a pattern. Large meals, heavy starches, desserts. A few hours later, reading became harder. Road signs looked softer. By evening, his eyes felt noticeably less comfortable. At first, he assumed he was imagining it. Then he started paying attention. The pattern kept repeating. What he was noticing wasn't necessarily permanent damage. It was a warning, a signal that his visual system was responding to changes occurring throughout the rest of his body. And that's the part most people miss. The eyes are often early messengers. They reveal problems before those problems become obvious elsewhere. Which brings us to the area of the retina that may be more important than any other. A tiny region responsible for your sharpest vision. The region that allows you to read fine print, recognize faces instantly, and see the details that make life feel rich and connected. And protecting that region becomes increasingly important with every passing decade. That tiny region is called the macula. Most people don't know its name, but they notice immediately when it stops performing the way it should. The macula is responsible for central vision. It's the reason you can read a text message without difficulty. It's the reason you recognize a familiar face across a room. It's the reason details look sharp instead of blurred. For such a small piece of tissue, it carries an enormous responsibility. And because it works so hard, it requires protection. Nature anticipated that problem. The macula contains unusually high concentrations of two compounds called lutein and zeaxanthin. You don't need to memorize those names, just understand what they do. Every day, light enters your eyes. Not just sunlight, television screens, phones, tablets, computer monitors, indoor lighting. Year after year, your retinal cells are exposed to that light. Most of the time, they handle it remarkably well. Part of the reason they can do that is because lutein and zeaxanthin act like a natural protective filter. They absorb a portion of that stress before it reaches the most sensitive visual cells underneath. Think of them as built-in protection, not perfect protection, but essential protection. The problem is that many adults gradually lose ground in this area without realizing it. Not because the body suddenly stops producing these compounds, because the body depends heavily on diet to maintain adequate levels, and modern eating habits often work against that goal. A generation ago, meals contained more leafy greens, more whole foods, and fewer highly processed options. Today, many people consume plenty of calories but relatively few nutrients that directly support retinal health. The result is subtle at first. Nobody wakes up one morning feeling a lutein deficiency. Instead, the retina slowly becomes less equipped to handle the stress it's exposed to every day. Then another factor enters the picture: oxidative stress. If you've watched health content before, you've probably heard the term, but here's what it means in simple language. Every cell in your body produces waste products as part of normal metabolism. When metabolism becomes less efficient, especially when blood sugar remains elevated more often than it should, those waste products increase. The retina is particularly vulnerable because it consumes so much oxygen. More oxygen use means more opportunity for oxidative damage. Now imagine what's happening. The demand for protection is increasing. At the same time, the supply of protective nutrients is decreasing. That's not a formula for immediate vision loss, but it is a formula for gradual decline over many years. And gradual decline is exactly how most people experience age-related vision problems. Not suddenly, quietly, almost invisibly, until one day they realize they're struggling with tasks that once felt effortless. I remember speaking with a woman in her early 70s who described it perfectly. She said, "I can still see, but everything feels less vivid than it used to." That observation stuck with me, because she wasn't describing blindness, she was describing erosion, a slow loss of visual quality. The colors weren't as rich, the details weren't as sharp, the experience wasn't as effortless. And that distinction matters, because vision loss doesn't always arrive as darkness. Sometimes it arrives as a gradual fading of clarity, a gradual loss of contrast, a gradual reduction in the quality of what you see. Which raises an important question. If the retina depends so heavily on healthy circulation and proper metabolic support, what happens when the systems responsible for regulating fluid, pressure, and blood flow begin struggling too? That's where another organ enters the story. An organ most people would never think to connect with eyesight. Your kidneys. And the relationship between the two is far more important than it appears at first glance. The connection between the kidneys and the eyes isn't obvious. One helps you see, the other helps filter waste from the bloodstream. On the surface, they seem completely unrelated, but inside the body, they share something important. Both depend on networks of extremely delicate blood vessels. Both require precise control of fluid balance, and both are highly sensitive to long-term metabolic stress. That's why physicians have long noticed a pattern. When the smallest blood vessels begin struggling, the effects often appear in the kidneys and the eyes around the same time. Not necessarily on the same day, not necessarily with the same symptoms, but through the same underlying process. The challenge is that neither organ complains very loudly in the beginning. Kidney function can decline significantly before a person notices anything unusual. Vision can follow a surprisingly similar path. Changes occur quietly, gradually, almost politely, until one day the difference becomes difficult to ignore. What makes this especially important after 60 is that the body's ability to regulate pressure and circulation is no longer as forgiving as it once was. Arteries become stiffer. Blood vessels lose some of their flexibility. Recovery takes longer. The margin for error narrows. That matters because healthy vision depends on more than just receiving nutrients. It also depends on maintaining the right pressure environment inside the eye. Most people think of blood pressure as something measured in the arm, a number discussed during annual checkups. But there is another form of pressure that receives far less attention: pressure inside the eye itself. When that pressure remains elevated for long periods, it can place stress on one of the most important structures in the entire visual system, the optic nerve. The optic nerve is often compared to a cable. Millions of visual signals travel through it every day. Everything you see must pass through that connection before reaching the brain. Without it, sight becomes impossible. What makes optic nerve damage so concerning is how quietly it develops. In many cases, there is no pain, no dramatic symptom, no obvious warning. People often assume they would know if something serious were happening. Unfortunately, that assumption isn't always correct. The brain is remarkably good at compensating for gradual losses. A small reduction in peripheral vision may go unnoticed for years. Tiny blind spots can be ignored. Subtle changes become the new normal, until eventually the problem becomes large enough that compensation is no longer possible. That's why eye health cannot be separated from overall health. The eye is not an isolated organ. It's connected to everything: your circulation, your blood pressure, your metabolism, your inflammation levels, your sleep quality, even the foods you eat every day. All of these factors leave fingerprints inside the eye. A few years ago, I spoke with a retired teacher named Margaret. For nearly 6 years, she had been updating her glasses almost every 18 months. Each new prescription seemed to help temporarily. Then the blur slowly returned. She wasn't diabetic. Her routine blood work rarely raised concern. Her eye examinations showed only mild age-related changes, and yet she felt as though something was being missed. What finally changed her perspective wasn't a new prescription. It wasn't a procedure. It was a pattern. A pattern she had been living with for years without realizing its significance. And once she recognized it, the entire conversation shifted from eyesight to metabolism, from symptoms to causes, from the eyes themselves to the environment supporting them. And that's where the story becomes even more interesting, because some of the most important factors influencing vision aren't found in an eye exam at all. They're found in the nutrients your retinal cells depend on every single day. Margaret wasn't looking for a breakthrough. She simply wanted to understand why her vision seemed to change throughout the day. For years, she had accepted the standard explanation. Your eyes are getting older. At first, that answer felt reasonable. Then the patterns became harder to ignore. Her vision was usually at its best early in the morning. Reading felt easier. Small print appeared clearer. Even colors seemed a little sharper. By late afternoon, things often changed. Words became less distinct. Headlights created more glare. The same.